Welcome everyone to our webinar entitled Leveraging Teacher Voice to Promote Teachers' Social-Emotional Learning. Before we get started, I just wanted to share some logistical pieces. This webinar is structured to alternate between reviewing the current research about teacher voice and teacher social-emotional learning with conversations between those who are engaged in this work. And so we're very eager to hear about your thoughts, ideas, and questions that you have. But to make sure that we've left time for our presenters, we've saved time at the end to give you all opportunity to ask them directly. But please feel free to share those thoughts, ideas, and questions that you have throughout the webinar today in the chat. And I will be monitoring the chat and sharing them with the presenters at the end. And because there is quite a large group with us today, we wanted to kindly ask that you please mute your microphones until you're ready to ask the presenters your questions. And so that's all I had in terms of logistical pieces. We wanted to start off our webinar by providing a brief introduction to our presenters and the regional educational laboratories. My name is Marisa Crowder. I'm a researcher for REL Pacific. My role today is largely just to support our presenters in sharing all of their valuable information that they're going to present today. I am joined by Dr. Samantha Holquist, who has a strong background in promoting student voice. She'll be reviewing the literature on teacher voice and teacher social-emotional learning. I'm also joined by Miss Jenny Gillett and Miss Sarah Pierce, who will be engaging in conversations about their work in these areas. Miss Gillett is an instructional coach in Oregon, and Miss Pierce is a researcher for REL Northwest. Slide, please. Thank you. So what is a regional educational laboratory, or a REL? RELs are funded by the Institute for Education Sciences and are charged with supporting educators bridge research to practice to improve students' academic outcomes. There are 10 RELs throughout the country. This webinar is what we call a cross-REL event, in that it was developed in collaboration between REL Pacific and REL Northwest. REL Pacific serves the state of Hawaii as well as other US affiliated countries and territories in the Pacific region. REL Pacific's leadership area is social-emotional learning, and this webinar is one activity in which we aim to share promising strategies for promoting teacher social-emotional learning. REL Northwest serves Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. Across the RELs that you see on our map, our services are provided to educators at no cost. Next slide. So the focus on both teacher and student social-emotional learning has been of particular concern throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, as COVID-19 has introduced and even increased social-emotional challenges for teachers and students. For instance, teachers and students may be experiencing tremendous stress due to health-related or financial concerns. In some cases, COVID-19 has introduced or increased exposure to trauma, and teachers and students have limited access to their social support networks that would typically get them through such difficult times. Specific to the school context, teachers and students may also be dealing with frustrations related to shifting to online learning and staying engaged in a virtual environment. So for the purpose of this webinar, we're focusing on teacher social-emotional learning and teacher voice, because we know that not only is it important in and of itself, but when we promote teacher social-emotional learning and teacher voice, we're also supporting the social-emotional needs of our students as well. So our objectives for today are to provide an overview of social-emotional learning, the role of social-emotional learning in the classroom, and how social-emotional learning relates to student outcomes. We also hope to provide an overview of teacher social-emotional learning and how it relates to students' social-emotional learning, to define teacher voice and review research-based promising practices for implementing teacher voice strategies to support teacher social-emotional learning, and to learn how an education researcher and instructional specialist are supporting the use of teacher voice to support teacher social-emotional learning in schools and districts. So on our agenda for today, Dr. Holquist will begin by reviewing the existing literature on teacher social-emotional learning. Then Ms. Gillett and Ms. Pierce will share about their experiences in this area. Then Dr. Holquist will review promising practices for teacher voice and describe how it relates to teacher social emotional learning. And Ms. Gillett and Ms. Pierce will then discuss examples of how teacher voice was used to promote social emotional learning in their work. After these conversations, we'll provide time for you all to ask any questions that you may have for our presenters. And we'll post a feedback survey so that we can get your input on ways we can improve future webinars. And then we'll adjourn the webinar. But again, we invite you to ask your questions and share your thoughts and ideas throughout the webinar in the chat. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Holquist.
Thank you, Marisa. Before I get started, I also want to say that this webinar is recorded and we will be sharing out the recording and the slides after the webinar is complete. So the research on teacher social emotional learning really starts with understanding what is social emotional learning. So social emotional learning is defined as the process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. Social emotional learning happens in schools in multiple different facets. We typically encourage school-wide approaches to social emotional learning, but there are specific classroom approaches as well to social emotional learning that fall underneath those school-wide approaches. And so social emotional learning in the classroom looks like explicit instruction and academic integration. Explicit instruction is when we have freestanding lessons that focus on teaching students developmentally appropriate social emotional competencies. And these are typically provided through evidence-based SEL programs and curriculum. Academic integration is when we incorporate social emotional learning opportunities into the classroom curriculum and environment. And so one is having explicit lessons set aside for SEL, and the other is integrating it into our reading and math lessons so that students are both learning explicitly and then learning through their normal classroom learning. And SEL supports student outcomes in lots of different ways. And so it promotes positive student outcomes in encouraging social emotional competencies. It encourages engagement in classroom learning, attendance and test scores and grade point averages, all of these increase. It also reduces negative outcomes, including conduct problems, emotional distress, and substance abuse in the future. And so when we have social emotional learning in our schools and classrooms, we see a lot of positive benefits, and then we see a lot of reductions in negative outcomes that we might want to avoid. So a part of social emotional learning is making sure that teachers also have social emotional learning. For SEL practices to be successful, teachers must have the social emotional competencies necessary to model appropriate behaviors to students and provide adequate SEL supports and opportunities for students to learn. Essentially, if teachers don't have social emotional learning and they don't have the social emotional competencies that we want to see in students, it's going to be really hard for them to teach students those competencies. Much like if a teacher doesn't know math or reading concepts to teach students, it'll be hard to teach them those concepts. And so promising practices for promoting teacher SEL are beginning to emerge. There isn't a lot of research on promoting teacher SEL so far, but there are things coming out from the field. One of the first ones is mindfulness strategies, which promote teacher self-awareness and self-management. Another is engaging in professional learning communities to promote relationship skills. So having teachers working together helps to promote relationship skills between teachers, and then teachers can support students in working together and building those skills as well. And then cultural awareness and implicit bias training promote self-awareness and social awareness for teachers. And then they can teach those skills that they learn in those trainings to their students. And so I am going through the research fairly quickly because I do want to provide enough time to hear from our guest speakers and so that we can have a lot of time for participant Q&A. But please ask any questions that you have in the chat and we'll answer them afterwards. And so very quick, sorry, not very quick. So let's talk with Ms. Gillett and Actually, I'm going to say Jenny and Sarah. Let's talk with Jenny and Sarah around their experiences with helping teachers with social emotional learning. And so Jenny, you recently participated in professional development on social emotional learning. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Can you hear me okay right now?
Yeah.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So I had a unique situation where I was hired in March of 2020 at my school district as an instructional coach, and within a week, schools closed because of COVID-19. And it was a week before spring break started in our school district. And so by the time we all came back after spring break, there was still a lot of scrambling to kind of figure out exactly what we were going to do, obviously, in this situation that we'd never been in before. And the district had a really quick turnaround where they were offering a course for teachers on social emotional learning for ourselves. And it was an 8-week-long course that the learning design consisted of about an hour or an hour and a half a week of pre-recorded sessions that was content where we could do reflection and watch the video on our own time when we were able to make that time. And then there was also an hour later in the week where we could meet live, and in those meetings we could talk with other teachers, other administrators in the district and talk about what we were learning. As someone who had only been working in the district for a week, and I hadn't had a chance yet to even meet the teachers that I worked with and get a chance to go to the sites where I was going to be working, this professional learning was a lifesaver for me. It was also the first time that I explicitly was being offered as a teacher professional learning that was geared towards my social emotional wellness, and it was invaluable. And I would say that some of my greatest takeaways from that experience was really learning about creating self-awareness around my own resiliency and social emotional well-being, and in particular, the habits and dispositions of resilient educators, which is extremely necessary when you are working with students. So being able to reflect on where my strengths and weaknesses were with how I was taking care of myself was very important. And then I think also that I learned that, you know, resiliency is not a fixed thing, and that there are times in our lives where we will be challenged even more, and to know that there are skills and supports and ways that I can build up my resiliency was very helpful. And also spent a lot of time in the course learning about identity markers and learning about how we identify as adults and humans, and how that affects how we relate with the other adults and then the students as well in our school systems was very helpful.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing. Sarah, you have been working with educators in Washington State to implement social emotional learning practices. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. So in 2018, the Washington legislature asked the Department of Education to go back and revise the social emotional learning standards that they had. So the team gathered up and we got to coach them by bringing in some research and ideas about how to better shift social emotional learning. So that particular team really dived into two big, huge concepts alongside of developing their standards. And so to develop a frame and an implementation. And so those implementation pieces really focused on four key concepts of equity, cultural responsiveness, trauma-informed practices, and universal design. And so what we've done to be able to help assist teachers to address how to implement social emotional learning, we've also had to work on being able to support teachers and educators across the board to develop their own capacity to understand what is social emotional learning and what does it look like as the adult. So things that we've done is to be able to develop a couple of capacity building training series. And so those training series really dig deeply into implementing SEL with that emphasis on equity, and then another training on community members as partners to support social emotional learning, and then the academic success through SEL and SEL through MTSS. So specifically in our equity piece, we've really talked about trauma-informed practices and how that connects back to educator wellness. So when teachers are happy they are happy to stay in a school and happy to continue that continuity and those relationships with kids. And teachers are more happy to stay with their colleagues and build up a stronger system. So those are a couple big things that we've been doing to support Washington teachers about connecting not just student learning, but the adult SEL piece to it too.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing. And thank you for giving a little bit more background on school-wide SEL implementation and what that looks like as a system approach. So do you have questions for one another that you would like to ask based on the experiences shared?
So of course, one of my biggest questions as a practitioner who gets to be in a school and gets to have training, what would be the biggest thing for those who really are still questioning about the efficacy of social emotional learning and trying to implement what they might say, yet another thing?
It's a great question. And I think I would interpret that question as, you know, a big part of it, that teachers can see value in it. And so I feel that given the opportunity that I had, and it was the first time that I had engaged in this type of professional learning, I did find a lot of value in it. I noticed that a lot of the conversation initially was among educators who immediately wanted to jump to how to do this with their students. And I felt like over time, the teachers were realizing that they could spend more time together thinking about it and reflecting on their own selves and understanding that better before they're prepared to go out and model these behaviors for students. And the second piece, I can't remember the second half of your question, sorry, Sarah. There was one other piece that.
When trying to balance out like multiple initiatives within a school, how can we help teachers to be able to implement both possibly a new math curriculum alongside of digital learning and social emotional learning?
Yeah, I think that gets at a little bit of where I've been thinking to the last time that you and I talked, which is how can it be better integrated or aligned with the other initiatives as well. And so I think that there has to be a way to see the, I think, connectedness of teachers' social emotional well-being to them being able to actually take in more around whether it's a new math curriculum or whether it is also another initiative. And so to me, it's a foundational ground, you know, you have to have that groundwork piece in place. It includes relationship building, as Sammy said. And so any type of professional learning is going to be more effective when teachers have the ability to relate with each other and hear each other's different opinions and be able to have difficult conversations and have difficult conversations about students and how students are doing.
Thank you, Jenny. Did you have any questions for Sarah?
I think I was, you know, hinting at that before. I think, you know, I'm curious to see, being in a large urban school district, I am curious to see how social emotional learning will be aligned with other initiatives. And I haven't had that opportunity yet. But I know that as I set forth to work with the teachers that I do as a coach, I'm going to look at that in ways that I can have it be integrated, you know, for other initiatives that they're being asked to take on as well. And I'd love to hear any other experience that you've had, Sarah, around that.
Yeah, so when I was in the classroom and when I was an administrator before I got into this side of the work, I think it was just like, as you mentioned, to be able to have teachers and educators see those shifts and how they can support each other. So it wasn't so much of being able to say, here's your math problem. That was part of my role way back when I was a math coach. It wasn't so much of here's the math concepts, but how does that relate into other social justice aspects? So instead of saying, being able to measure an area, why are we actually measuring that area? What's the value of it? Which then goes back into pro-social needs and tying back into those concepts of what's the value of social emotional learning and to support your own self-regulation as well as those relationships around you. and connecting, why are we reading what we're reading? Why are we creating art in the way that we're creating art? Was it trying to say about us internally and externally? So the more explicit connections that we can make between academic content and the connection to social emotional growth was always super beneficial. And the other big thing that we really did was hone in a lot with cultural responsiveness. So a lot of my work also focuses on Indian communities and working with tribal nations and their students. And so being able to really be culturally responsive to know what is unique to that community, what's the values of those communities to bring out. Because if we're reading certain pieces that are continuing misconceptions of people, then those are things that we definitely want to be able to note, because we don't want to do harm to kids and therefore harm to educators.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Those are excellent points and 100% agree. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much, Jenny, for also sharing. So for the sixth check, we're going to move on to teacher voice. So as Jenny and Sarah both talked about, social emotional learning is really important when we're thinking about integrating teacher social emotional learning is really important when we're thinking about integrating social emotional learning into the classroom. And for supporting students in helping with their social emotional learning, from designing instructional materials to teaching students how to be resilient, to identifying areas where instructional materials might not necessarily align with students' backgrounds or cultures. And so one way that we think about supporting teacher social emotional learning is through teacher voice. And so there's a strong connection between teacher social emotional learning and teacher voice. There are few teacher-focused SEL strategies. A few teacher voices SEL strategies are grounded in a system-wide approach that helps districts and school leaders identify and support SEL needs of their teachers. Successful implementation of SEL programs and practices depends heavily upon teachers' commitment to SEL and their level of comfort with the content and the perceived support from the school. So like both Sarah and Jenny alluded to, if teachers don't feel like they're a part of the SEL initiatives, if they don't feel like it's aligned with what they're doing in the classroom, if it's just another thing that they're gonna have to do, they're less likely to be committed to it and they're less likely to have buy-in to it. And then finally, research suggests that promoting teacher voice supports teachers in their implementation of SEL. And so if teachers have a voice in what is happening with social emotional learning, they're more likely to understand the content, learn about the content, and then implement it with their students. And so what is teacher voice? Teacher voice refers to the ways in which teachers have opportunities to participate in education decisions that affect their classroom, school, or district. And so this is really about having teachers at the decision-making table, supporting leaders in making decisions, or having teacher leaders work alongside district administrators or school level administrators to really support our efforts to incorporate teachers' ideas and feedback into the decisions that are being made. Teacher voice strategies include soliciting teacher feedback on school-wide decisions, encouraging teachers to solve problems in their classrooms, and supporting teachers in making school-wide decisions. So having teachers at the decision-making table alongside principals and vice presidents, vice principals, so that they can be a part of those decisions. They can be a part of the conversations that lead to the decisions, and their thoughts and opinions are included. And so through teacher voice strategies, district and school leaders may be able to better identify and support the SEL needs of their teachers. When teachers are able to share what they need in social emotional learning or what they want, district and school leaders are better able to meet those needs and wants. And so 3 strategies for supporting teachers' SEL through teacher voice include instructional coaching model focused on social emotional learning, personalized self-reflection process around social emotional learning, and teacher feedback and collaboration when designing social emotional learning professional development. And I'm going to go into each of those more deeply now. So instructional coaching model. Instructional coaches work one-on-one with teachers to help them change habits, strengthen dispositions, set goals, and improve instruction. So this is where we have someone like Jenny, who is an instructional coach, working alongside a teacher to support their social emotional learning. As coaches work with teachers, teachers become more mindful and reflective about practices and mindset and learn how to turn toxic stress into motivating stress. And so maybe a coach will work with it. Maybe a teacher is really stressed out about like a student's behavior in the classroom and isn't sure how to address it. A coach will work with that teacher around identifying where maybe their stress is coming from, identifying how they can manage the stress themselves, and then also work with that teacher using the strategies that they taught the teacher to work with students on managing the stress that student might be causing in the classroom. As a result of this, teachers feel supported and become more resilient, allowing them to positively impact the students and faculty that they work alongside. And so by helping teachers identifying areas where they can grow, those teachers can then better be members of the community, and then also teach students how to manage the stresses or become more socially aware. There's lots of different social emotional competencies. That was just an easy one for that one. So personalized self-reflection process. Teachers individually self-reflect on their own social emotional needs and identify growth areas. And so we're going to share a tool a little bit later from Castle that is a guide for how to support teachers in their self-reflection. And it's a really easy guide to use as teachers think about different social emotional learning areas and can grow and can fill out how they align with those social emotional learning areas and areas that they can grow. Based on this self-reflection, teachers collaborate with one another to identify individual and group supports that leaders could provide for those growth areas. And so maybe teachers come together in their professional learning communities and talk about the self-reflection tool with one another, talk about areas where they really are struggling and areas where they're really excelling, and then work together on identifying specific needs that they might want from administrators. So maybe a specific need is professional development on becoming more resilient, or a need is a professional development on managing stress. And so they can collaborate with that together, talk to leaders about securing that professional development, or maybe they develop that professional development together and work with one another in developing those skills. And then teachers share their ideas around individual and group supports with leaders, and leaders work with teachers to provide supports. Finally, there's teacher feedback and collaboration, and this is kind of alluded to in the first two, but more specifically, leaders can solicit teacher feedback on the types of high quality and ongoing professional learning that they desire to support their individual social emotional learning and implementation of social emotional practices. And so this is really where leaders go directly to teachers and just ask, hey, what do you need? And this works really great alongside the self-reflection tool, because teachers will have had a chance to self-reflect on what they need. Leaders can support teachers in leading these professional development opportunities, such as teacher-to-teacher learning opportunities, to support teacher mentoring and leadership. And so by having teachers lead these professional development opportunities or work with an administrator in leading these professional development opportunities, or someone that is brought in from the outside, it really gives teachers an opportunity to grow their skills and learn the content deeper, and then provide that professional development learning ongoing throughout the school, because a teacher will have become an expert in that area. And then by encouraging teachers to identify and develop professional learning opportunities, leaders can not only better meet teachers' needs, but also increase teacher commitment. When teachers are a part of the decision-making process and they see that their needs are being met by administrators, they're more likely to feel happy about the school that they're working in, and more likely to be committed to implementing those social emotional needs with themselves and with their students. So that's just a little bit about the three strategies. We are at the end going to share resources that share more about the strategies. But I really quickly want to switch to Jenny and Sarah again to talk about how teacher voice can support teacher social emotional learning. So once again, we're going to start with Jenny. So Jenny, since you received their professional development, how have you supported teachers in their own social emotional learning?
So A tool that I have used previously as a coach and then continued to in the late spring is an empathy interview. And so a lot of my work initially after going through this training was interviewing the teachers that I was working with, and interviewing with a real mindset of wanting to really hear what their experiences were. And so the first couple times that I had met with these teachers, again, I had never worked with them before, so I'm developing a new relationship, and it was really about understanding what their experiences have been home, you know, as teachers during this pandemic, and then also what they are experiencing from their students and the families at their schools. And I think a lot of our work initially was also trying to better understand how they were eliciting student and family voice as well, because a lot of it was trying to understand why students could or couldn't engage. And I think there was a big question about, do you really know what's going on with your students and your families as well? So that was kind of a layered approach. And I would also say that, you know, another thing that I really took away from the training was being able to surface strengths and focus on strengths and optimism as well, especially in a really difficult time like this that was a shared experience that everyone was having. So surfacing their strengths. And I also think that you know, coaching, which I think is an incredible professional learning model that I think ultimately is foundationally about relationships and trust that you build with each other, and that, you know, teacher to teacher or educator to educator, you can't have the depth of relationship that you want to really move students and focus on inequities in our systems if you aren't both as adults able to manage and reflect on your social emotional well-being. And so I think that's kind of in the land that I'm living in right now, is that I know that the coaching won't be as powerful if we can't both be working on this together. And then I would also just throw in kind of an exciting note as we're getting closer to the school year here, that a group of teachers I'm working with are planning a unit, a project-based unit that integrates, it's high school, integrates different content areas, but it's around self-care and about learning, you know, about different cultures that and how they do self-care, and trying to appreciate that self-care isn't the same for everyone. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out with the teachers considering their own social emotional well-being as well.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
Yeah.
And
they decided, again, I guess I would say the teacher voice piece of that too, right? That they really have a voice in how they want to plan their curriculum this year, and that they have been given they've been empowered, right, to be able to do that. So.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point that like social emotional learning is going to look, self-management is going to look different for everybody. Resilience is going to look different for everybody. And so having teachers think about how that looks different for their students is really going to help them in understanding how it might look different for them too, as teachers in a similar work environment. And people, as we know, everybody handles stress differently. And so everyone's going to need a different way for dealing with that stress.
Absolutely.
I also think that empathy interviews is such a great example of another teacher voiced strategy that I didn't share. Of you enabled space for teachers to share about what's going on in their lives and how it's going. And by enabling, like by starting that conversation, you also were able to then start the conversation of, okay, this is what it looked like for you. How does this now look like for your students and your community members? How do you now, like we've had this conversation, what does this look like now for who's engaging in your classroom? And I think that's such a great tool to think about too. And I wish I would have included it earlier. Thank you so much, Jenny. So Sarah, in your work in Washington State again, have you seen any examples of how districts or schools have integrated teacher voice practices into teacher social emotional learning?
So they've all been in some pretty good deep planning phases to be able to integrate in doing.
Sorry, Sarah, you're muting and unmuting. Okay.
That's so weird. I apologize.
No.
So we've been really focused across a couple of different tiers. So working with the capacity builders. So those are like the districts and the ESDs or regional professional learning partners. And so as they're developing their plans, they're really being able to go back to be able to say a couple of different things. One is what we're doing going to work? And so with that, we've asked them to think about their readiness. And so with that readiness and getting teacher voice into that, they've talked about what is the actual general capacity to be able to implement either strategies or specific evidence-based program. And then what's the actual intervention specific capacity of that knowledge? So two big things that really amps up to understand where teachers are to be able to implement high quality social emotional learning. And then so bring those people back to the table to make the plans, because they're ultimately going to be the ones that are implementing the plans. And so within those classrooms, we're asking, you know, these capacity builders of principals and district superintendents and regional leads to be able to say, keep going back. You need to understand that capacity first to be able to know what is the actual motivation that has teachers even wanting to do social emotional learning. Because sometimes what you understand is that people want to implement social emotional learning to have people and students and vulnerable students to behave a certain way, as compared to being able for them to reflect on what is their core values and what does it look like within their community. And so sometimes just that adult motivation to implement SEL is a really key indicator to be able to say, how will we approach this as a system to move forward to the betterment of all of our kids within the community. And so going back to the teachers has been a big piece to understand that there's lots of little plans to be able to do surveys with teachers to better understand what is it they want to do, what is their capacity, what do they have time for, and is this at the highest level. What's really interesting is across our region, we've had multiple states have their opening guidance come back up, and in both Washington and Oregon, equity and social emotional learning has been at the forerunner of reopening schools as compared to the academics, which is one of the questions that I noticed in here is like, how are we thinking about social emotional learning, and is it at the detriment to academic instruction? And so we know that social emotional learning supports not only engage kids in academics, but it also engages adults into being part of a community, whether that's the school community, the learning community as a larger entity, or within the whole entire system entity. So they're really, really big trying to approach that with that, again, that cultural responsiveness to be able to say, do our teachers feel like they belong in order to support the kids?
Thank you so much, Sarah. In the Pacific region, I can also say that the social emotional learning and equity is at the forefront of their reopening plans too. And so I think that is really telling that many states are including, and territories are including equity and social emotional learning at the forefront. To build off, sorry, Sarah.
It's been really exciting. We've had states who have avoided the term social emotional learning due to some political context. And even then, their opening guidance has actually come up with those terms, social emotional learning, as compared to wellness or behavioral support. So it's really exciting knowing that there's been educators in those work groups to lead policy and practice.
Yes, I agree that. And when we think about academics, there is currently research being conducted on the connections between social emotional learning and academics. And so we believe that as students increase in their social emotional learning, they are going to be, they're going to be able to complete their coursework better, they're going to be more engaged in the classroom, it's going to increase their academics. But there hasn't been a ton of research on that yet. REL Pacific is currently working on a study of the connections between social emotional learning and academic outcomes in the CNMI, and we are excited to show the results of that study in the next year or so. And so that should be really interesting of thinking about what you just mentioned, Sarah. Are we doing social emotional learning at the detriment of academics, or do they support one another? And so a lot of research hints that they probably support one another, but there's just a little bit, the research is just growing right now of that they definitely support one another. So is there anything else that Jenny and Sarah, you would like to share about teacher voice and social emotional learning before we move into questions?
What is really interesting, when I was doing research for the particular training in Washington on equity, we really focused on, in that particular piece, was trauma-informed practices and how that, with dosage and intensity, to talk about how that is connected with social emotional learning, but also coming on the teacher side and teacher wellness to this. And so we know that teaching is high demands. You're making millions of decisions within minutes time for multiple kids, and knowing how that's going to have effects later on. And so what was really interesting in this particular study by Herman, Hickman, Rosa, and Rinke is that they noticed teachers, they gave a survey to teachers to say, do you have coping skills for when you're stressed, do you have coping skills? And so about 10% said, or it was 7% that said that they were well adjusted, and 3% that said that they had high coping skills. And so what they noticed between the academics and those teachers who had high coping skills is that the students themselves had greater pro-social behavior as well as stronger academics in mathematics. They didn't study reading as much. But what they did notice on the flip side is that those teachers who had high stress and low coping abilities, so they didn't have any ways to self-mitigate or to be able to take a breath or feel that they had the resources for autonomy and voice, they felt that they had less coping skills and therefore actually had the lowest pro-social behavior in their classrooms, the most discipline referrals, and they had the highest concentration problems amongst their students. And so that was a really interesting study to talk about how educator health affects student outcomes for both social and academic.
Yeah, I would only add, and I've just been thinking about, how often are we asking educators, teachers in particular, how are you? How are you doing? And I think that the idea behind, being able to conduct interviews or even just being able to sit down and hear how a teacher is doing, and then to be able to connect that to what they're being asked to do with their students and with family is just, you can't separate them. And I think that it has an entirely different impact when they understand that they're being heard, and regularly. It's not a one-time thing, that this is an ongoing loop, as well. So.
Thank you. Yes. We always hope that all of these strategies will integrate, not just be a one-time thing. They'll be integrated into the school system as regularly, you're checking in with your teachers, or you're using these strategies to think about how are we as a school supporting our teachers to support our students. And so 100% Jenny, it shouldn't just be a one-time thing. It should be consistently. I want to say systematically, but I feel like that's like not necessarily the most pro SEL word. Okay, thank you so much, Jenny and Sarah, for sharing with us. And now I want to move on to participant question and answer. And so if you have any questions for me, Jenny, or Sarah, please put them in the chat and we will answer them. We will also ask some questions of ourselves and answer them if you don't have questions.
I saw one in the chat about empathy interviews that I could start with relatively, I think, quickly, and just that, because I think the question is to share the empathy interview, and the practice that I have used is very open-ended and not questions that would really direct somebody's response. And so when I was interviewing teachers in the spring, it was literally, tell me about a time that you felt successful recently. And because we were in the midst of a pandemic, everything came out about their experiences working with students during school closures and distance learning. And then what I try to hone my, practice on is being able to hear people's stories and then have follow-up questions to really try to understand specifically what their experience is without any predisposed, idea of what I think they're going to say. And so, yeah, they were pretty straightforward. I usually try to keep a really open-ended, positive question. And then I asked the flip side of maybe a time where they were struggling or feeling not successful.
Thank you, Jenny. My neighbors are doing yard work now, so I'm switching to headphones. Thank you so much. Do you have like a explicit, not explicit, but like a starter question, or is there a good way to develop empathy interviews?
I mean, I would say that a stem I use a lot is tell me about a time you felt, and again, it's more about hearing really specific lived experiences, and people often have to talk for a little bit before those start to come out. I know that we've also been coaching some other educators around communication, because it's definitely been elevated through other qualitative data that communication has really been broken down during this pandemic, and that students and families have felt really confused about. And so I think some of the questions that we were looking at crafting is, tell me a time where you felt like you had a really clear communication line with your school. Tell me about a time that you felt really confused and you didn't feel like you could communicate. And again, kind of really drawing out those stories to hear specifically what those examples were about.
Thank you, Jenny. Those are really great starting points. One question we had is, you used the term resilience a few times. How are we defining resilience? How do you go about measuring that? How is that implied when talking with teachers? Does Jenny or Sarah want to tackle that question, or I can too?
I can quickly just say that the professional learning that I referred to, that I engaged in the spring, they use the term social emotional learning, but resilience along with it. But I don't have a research-backed definition in front of me. I think I considered it and I really like the way it was described in this course, like a reserve, or a reservoir that I have, that I can tap into with strategies and ways to help myself get through a stressful or traumatic time, and practices that I have, that I know, almost like a toolkit or something like that. That's what I would offer.
I would definitely second that. So a lot of times whenever I use the term resiliency, it's really focused on how an individual doesn't just overcome, but learns through different things. And so I'm also thinking along the term of survivance. And so and resiliency isn't as actively being sought out for negative effects, but resiliency is just being able, when things happen, that you come through it and acknowledging that there is growth and skills that are learned from it. And sometimes those skills are positive, and sometimes those skills may be negative. So resiliency, I often think about, to be able to say, as Jenny talked about, the toolkit, the skills, the things that help you grow through it in order to come through it onto the other side.
Right, and measuring that is a little bit challenging, right? And so there isn't necessarily I don't know of an explicit survey that we can give to students to measure their social emotional competency around resilience. I know that Castle has a guide, and I'm sure Marisa has it that she can put in the chat, that includes many different assessments that are around measuring different social emotional competencies. I don't know explicitly that there's one in there around resilience, but I do know that oftentimes you can measure it through surveys or you can measure it through teacher observations. And so sometimes teachers can work with students around figuring out, after you set a definition around what resilience means for you and your school community, figuring out how we can observe that in our students, and also how you can observe that in yourselves. And so that can be using that self-reflection tool, and then after the community has a collective understanding amongst the teachers around what resilience might look like, seeing what that might, using that understanding to observe what that looks like in students, and having to talk to students as well around what that looks like to them. Thank you so much for your question. Another question that we had was for Sarah. At the beginning of the webinar, you talked about happy teachers and what that looks like. And so what contributes to happy teachers from your work and your background? And then Jenny, of course, feel free to jump in. You both have been teachers, and so I know the research around that.
Right. So the heart of me as being a classroom teacher, as an administrator, each individual is going to be different. So the needs of individual teachers and what makes them happy is going to be totally different than what might be appropriate for the person next door. So I love to quilt, but I love to cook, but I also have lots of colleagues that they hate to cook. So again, that's however you get to decide your own happiness. But then I'm going to put it on the research side too. So there's a couple other interesting pieces, and I added in those links in there about educator wellness. And so what typically, just overall within this particular piece of research that they talk about, is that when teacher conditions are positively looked at, then that's what makes teachers happy and keeps them within that school frame and keeps that consistency. And so things like the organizational leadership, is it clear? Is it, are there things that you know exactly how the organization works, and what are some of the nuances to that? When there's quality peer interactions, to be able to share ideas, be able to lift each other up in a way, as well as providing academic supports and understanding. When there's actual collaboration and not just collaboration, but what do we get to contribute to each other to lift up the whole entire system? And then also one of the bigger pieces is that influence. So again, that teacher voice, what is their influence on school and classroom decisions? So those are a couple big things that across the organization that keeps teachers happy, but things also such as health and wellness. Are you physically active? Are you mentally active? Are you taking care of yourself that way? Again, as Tammy talked about, is those mindfulness practices and being self-regulated within your own self. So when you know it, you can do it, and then you can grow it.
Thank you, Sarah. And we will be sharing a infographic at the end that talks a little bit about teacher well-being and what that looks like, based on the research that we created a couple months ago, right before COVID-19 hit. Great timing. So the very last question that I want to ask is really rooting this all into students and communities. And so, because education, we serve our students in our communities. And so when you think about teacher social emotional learning, and we kind of hinted at this in the beginning, how does teacher voice and social emotional learning go on to promote student voice and student choice as it's related to social emotional learning? So in your experience, how are those two connected?
I guess I'm going to speak kind of as a parent right now and as an educator, because what I've also seen with my daughter's experience in school. But I think if I'm understanding your question, Sammy, is this idea and this notion of feeling that things are done to you. And so I wonder whether some of the social emotional learning that teachers are doing with students sometimes doesn't feel authentic to them, and teachers as well, perhaps. And so I guess the connection with student voice and student choice is, how do we help students authentically, how do we build the relationships, the trust that needs to be there so that students feel that the social emotional learning is for them to take on their own path and their own journey, right, to get through what they need to get through. And that, I think, is a difference, than just saying we're gonna, I don't know. I think there's different levels of authenticity around how social emotional learning takes place.
I agree. Sarah, did you want to? I agree, Jenny. And I think when we think about authenticity, if a teacher feels like it's authentic, then they're able to move that authenticity down to students. And from my background, from the student voice realm, if teachers don't have voice in their school, it's really hard to give students voice in their school. It's hard to create space for something that you don't have yourself. And so I would wonder, like you said, Jenny, as we're thinking about giving teachers a voice and making sure social emotional learning is authentic and something useful to students in the future, I would wonder if teachers also need to feel like it's useful for them and that it's something that isn't just getting done to them. Like they're not just getting forced to do social emotional learning. Future research question for somebody someday. Sarah?
No, I totally agree. If you're not your authentic self and you don't bring that passion and that curiosity, kids know it straight off the bat. And younger kids may not articulate it, but high school kids sure will. And middle school kids definitely will, because they just are that way. And again, like as you said, Sammy, if you're a student looking up and you feel like you have voice, it's because people have made space for that. And in order for that space to be made, teachers have a voice to be able to say it. And if we're not addressing the whole entire system to be able to support social emotional learning as beyond putting in a program and teaching a particular class day one, page one to fidelity, then that can crumble the whole entire system. And ultimately what we want to be able to do is have our students be reflective of the communities that they are in. And my tagline that I'm always going to say is, like for kids to grow up to be happy, healthy, productive adults. And so what that looks like, I can't describe that for the kid, but that also has to be developed over time.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Jenny. So we are at time. So very quickly, I want to show, these are the list of resources that we have. It includes this self-reflection cycle. It includes the professional development, thinking about supporting teachers and doing professional development. It also includes some infographics on school climate and sense of well-being and teacher well-being. These resources will be shared out with the slide. And then finally, we would really...
One note, because there was a question about what elements contribute to happy teachers. And I just wanted to just point to the very last bullet on growing well-being in schools, and that shares some more information about that topic. So sorry about that, Sammy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So really quickly, we would really appreciate it if you could fill out this feedback survey in the chat that Marisa just posted. It means a lot to us when we can improve our practice based off of your feedback. And so if you could take 5 minutes to just fill out that survey really quickly, that would really help us in making sure that future webinars that we offer to you are useful. And so my one last thing is I want to say thank you on behalf of Marisa, Jenny, and I, and Sarah, for participating in the webinar today. We will have another webinar in November that is on social emotional learning and culturally responsiveness. And so if you're interested, let us know, and we will share that. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.